Okay, our overall topic today is the Kennedy assassination, burial of a president. Our first subtopic is events of November 23rd, 1963, which is very short, but we did have some things happen the day after the president was assassinated. Yes. Okay, I'll ask her if she wants to do that. Thanks. Ms. Hodges, you have the option of staying or going. Okay. Events of November 23rd, 1963. Now remember, if we go back, the president was assassinated on Friday, was flown back to D.C., has been through the autopsy, etc., and now it's Saturday, November 22nd. After the autopsy, the body of John F. Kennedy was taken to the East Room of the White House. It was taken to the East Room of the White House. Anybody want to guess why it was taken there? What's that? Yes, very good. A viewing by only special people from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. that day. Family members and government dignitaries were allowed to pay their last respects. It was a viewing, but obviously it was a closed casket. Okay, but it wasn't in terms of viewing. So on Saturday, November 23rd, 1963, the body of John F. Kennedy was taken to the East Room of the White House, where from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., family members and government dignitaries were allowed to pay their last respects to the fallen president. So it was not open to the public, so to speak. It was only family and government dignitaries. That's really all that happened on November 23rd, 1963. That was all that happened that day. So we'll go to events of November 24th, 1963. The only thing I would say here is keep in mind, and we won't go back and forth, but keep in mind that what else happened on this date back in Dallas was Oswald's assassination. Okay, so all this happens, okay? On Sunday, November 24th, 1963, there was a military processional from the White House to the Capitol. On Sunday, November 24th, 1963, there was a planned military processional. What's another name for a processional? A parade. Okay? There was a military processional or parade scheduled that would go from the White House to the Capitol. Okay, a military parade from the White House to the Capitol. Basically what they were going to do is they were going to take the president's body from the East Room of the White House and have a military parade to the Capitol, where they were going to place the president's body under the Capitol Rotunda, which is that dome, for all Americans to honor him until 8 p.m. that night. So they gave family and government dignitaries the opportunity from 10 to 6 the day before to pay their respects. Now they're going to give any American that wants to the same opportunity to pay their respects from the president from the time they move his body from the White House to the Capitol and place it under the rotunda until 8 o'clock that night. Americans could come in freely in the rotunda and pay their respects to the president as well. That was the plan for the 24th. Okay? Now, we'll kind of tell you what happens in a timeline. At 12:34 p.m., Jackie and Robert Kennedy enter the East Room of the White House. At 12:34 p.m. that afternoon of November 24th, 1963, Jackie Kennedy and her brother-in-law Robert Kennedy enter the East Room of the White House, and the president's coffin is open for them. Okay? So at 12:34 p.m., Jackie and Robert Kennedy enter the East Room of the White House, in which then the president's coffin is open for them. Jackie places these 5 items in the president's coffin. Jackie places these 5 items inside the president's coffin. 1, a letter from herself. A letter from herself. 2, a letter from her daughter Caroline. She was old enough to write. A letter from her daughter Caroline. 3, a piece of paper with John F. Kennedy Jr. scribbling on it. Okay, he was very small. So a scribbled sheet or a piece of paper with John Kennedy Jr.'s scribbling on it. 4, a pair of gold cufflinks that she had given the president. 4, a pair of gold cufflinks that she had given the president. And 5, a scrimshaw bearing the presidential seal. A scrimshaw bearing the presidential seal. Does anybody know what a scrimshaw is?
It's a whale tooth or whale bone that's etched.
Yeah, here's one right here. This is an exact copy of one that President Kennedy had. It's not obviously his, but this is exactly what Burke said. This is a scrimshaw. It's a whale's tooth. This one happens to be etched with a ship on both sides. The one that Jackie put in wasn't this big, but it had the presidential seal. So if you want to kind of pass that around, look at it again. So those are the 5 items that Jackie put in the coffin. A letter from herself, a letter from her daughter Caroline, a scribbled sheet of paper from John Jr., a pair of gold cufflinks she had given the president, and a scrimshaw bearing the presidential seal. Robert Kennedy then placed 2 items in the coffin. One, an engraved silver rosary. For you Catholics, you know what that is. An engraved silver rosary. And 2, his PT 109 tie pin. Okay? His PT 109 tie pin. Now I'm going to tell you the story on these. There were 2 different tie pins that were made during the Kennedy presidency. One is a picture, it's basically a tie tack of the PT 109 boat, and one says Kennedy 60 on it, meaning the election of 1960. And the other one just said Kennedy on it. And they were meant for his re-election in '64. He just didn't put the year on it. And then Robert Kennedy used these when he ran for president in '68. And they were basically gifts that were given to people to have them support the election. So I'll pass this around. So the one that Robert Kennedy placed in was his own PT 109 tie pin that had Kennedy 60 on it that his brother had given him. Now you may have picked this up from when we watched the Kennedy detail, but according to Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who escorted Jackie and Robert to the White House that day, Jackie asked Agent Hill to get her what? Do you remember?
Scissors.
A pair of scissors. And he went, you don't have to write everything down, just get the gist. And he retrieved the scissors for Jackie, and then he stepped out of the room. And he remember in the movie, he said he heard a clip from the area of the coffin and assumed that Mrs. Kennedy had cut a lock of her husband's hair before the coffin was closed. Okay? He didn't know that for sure, but I think he was correct in his assumption. Okay? Once this was done, Secret Service agent Hill escorted Mrs. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy from the East Room of the White House. They came and got the casket. They loaded it on a horse-drawn caisson. Horse-drawn caisson that was setting out in front of the White House. So after both Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy placed items in the coffin, Mrs. Kennedy asked Mr. Hill to find her a pair of scissors, which he did, and then stepped out of the room. He heard the clip and assumed that she had cut a lock of the president's hair for herself. The coffin was closed, and the body bearers, which we'll talk about, came and loaded the casket and took it down in front of the White House and loaded it on a horse-drawn caisson. Okay? At 1:08 p.m., that military processional parade began its journey from the White House to the Capitol. I want you to envision in your mind, and you will get a chance to walk this same route while we're in D.C. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets from the White House to the Capitol as that parade made its way. and it arrived at the Capitol at 1:47 p.m. So it left at 1:08, it took the route, which you'll get a chance to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. Hundreds of thousands of people were lined up in the streets as that processional took place. And it arrived at Capitol Hill, the steps of Capitol Hill, at 1:47 p.m. They arrived, and at 1:52 p.m., a 21-gun salute was fired outside the Capitol as body bearers carried the casket up the steps of the Capitol to the rotunda. Okay, you'll get to see this on film. So at 1:52 p.m., a 21-gun salute is fired, and the body bearers carried the casket up the stairs to the rotunda. Yep, you betcha. 1:08 p.m., the presidential parade began from the White House to the Capitol. It was watched by hundreds of thousands of people as it traveled from the White House to the Capitol, arriving at the Capitol at 1:47 p.m. At 1:52, a 21-gun salute is fired as the body bearers are carrying the casket up the stairs to the rotunda. At 2:02 p.m., in the Capitol Rotunda, at 2:02 p.m., in the Capitol Rotunda, Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana delivered the eulogy for President Kennedy. At 2:02 p.m. in the Capitol Rotunda, Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana delivered the presidential eulogy. And it was entitled, "In a Moment, It Was No More." I'm going to read this to you. I want you just to put your pencils down and just think. Very famous eulogy. In a moment, it was no more. You'll get a chance to see part of the speech on film. There was the sound of laughter, and in a moment, it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a wit in a man neither young nor old, but a wit full of an old man's wisdom and of a child's wisdom. Then, in a moment, it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a man marked with scars of his love of country, a body active with the surge of life far, far from spent, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a father with a little boy and a little girl, and the joy of each in the other, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a husband who asked much and gave much, and out of the giving and the asking, wove with a woman what could not be broken in life, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands, and kissed him, and closed the lid of a coffin. Where did that occur? Parkland Hospital, remember? A piece of each of us died at that moment. Yet in death he gave himself to us. He gave us of a good heart from which the laughter came. He gave us of a profound wit from which a great leadership emerged. He gave us of a kindness and strength fused into the human courage to seek peace without fear. He gave us of his life that we too in turn might give. He gave that we might give of ourselves, that we might give to one another until there would be no room at all, for the bigotry, the hatred, prejudice, and the arrogance which converted in that moment of horror to strike him down. In leaving us these gifts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States, leaves with us. Will we take them, Mr. President? Will we have now the sense and responsibility and courage to take them? I pray to God that we will. Now look back here, and I want you to go to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th paragraph. Okay? And look at the end of it. He said, He gave us of a kindness and strength fused into the human courage to seek peace without fear. What's he referring to? To seek peace without fear. The Cuban Missile Crisis. How many times did he mention wit in the speech? Okay? He talked about bigotry, right? How about this? What's he mean here? He gave us of His life that we too in turn might give. He gave that we might give of ourselves, that we might give to one another. What does he mean? What's he referring to there? Ask not what your country can do for you. Anyway, it's a great speech. I'm going to tell you something. If you look up here, this is one of my proudest possessions. Here's Mike Mansfield when he ran for the Senate. He was Times Man of the Year when he was majority leader. This is a copy of the eulogy that he gave at Kennedy's funeral rotunda. On December 4th, 1963, just a little over a week or so after the assassination, and I don't know who this is, but Mrs. R.L. Irvin from Salem, Oregon, wrote Mike Mansfield a letter asking for a copy of the eulogy because she enjoyed it so much. Here's a copy of her letter, of his letter back to her, and the copy of the rotunda speech. Pretty cool.
So why was he killed in the war?
He was a very good question, Shannon. He was very good friends with John Kennedy. They were very good friends. This is really kind of sad to me to say because it's a tough deal, but Mike Mansfield lived to be 94 years old. And he worked almost till the last day of his life. He worked for Goldman Sachs in Washington, D.C. And when I took my kids to D.C., he would meet with them every year. He was such a kind man. Tall, slender guy, a man of very few words. We used to ask him questions, and to hear him answer these questions were incredible. I'll give you a couple examples. The kids would always ask him a question. He'd give an answer that he thought was too long because he was very quiet. He'd say, "Oh, a little windy on that one." And it was just kind of, he was an Irish guy, just a wonderful man. Anyway, a couple questions that come to mind is one of the kids asked him what they thought of John Kennedy. And he basically said, could have been one of the greatest, but never had time. Then when Bill Clinton had his trouble with the Monica Lewinsky thing and all that, and one of the kids, I just about rolled my eyes because Mike was a very moral man, very Christian man. He says, one of the kids says, what do you think of Bill Clinton? And this was President Clinton, this was right after his problems. And this is a typical Mike Mansfield. He kind of looked up and he says, politically, one of the greatest. Morally, no comment. That's all he said. But he was such a kind man. I just wish he would have lived. Here's a guy that should have lived forever. The good Lord should have said, this guy should live forever because he was such a great man. So you really missed out by not getting the opportunity to see him. He was a tremendous individual. And we'll talk more about him when we talk about the Vietnam War and his conversations with Lyndon Johnson. And I'll tell you about another question that a kid asked him, but it isn't relevant. But anyway, Mike Mansfield gave the eulogy at that point. After the eulogy, Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline went and knelt by the coffin, and Mrs. Kennedy kissed the flag at 2:17 p.m. So after Mansfield's eulogy ended, Mrs. Kennedy took her daughter Caroline by the hand. They went to the coffin, knelt, and kissed the flag. And you'll get a chance to see that on film as well. That was 2:17 p.m. So just very shortly after Mansfield completed his eulogy. Mrs. Kennedy took Caroline by the hand. They knelt by the coffin, and Mrs. Kennedy kissed the flag. At 2:19 p.m., the Kennedy family left Capitol Hill, and what began at that time? At 2:19, what did the American people have the opportunity to do when they left? Come pay their respects. And how long were they going to be able to do that? Till 8, what did I say? 8 p.m. So from 2:19 in that area, people have that opportunity. Now, people started to come right away, and they could tell that wasn't going to work, so officials made the decision pretty early that they would not close at 8 p.m., that they would leave it open as long as people were showing up. Okay? So officials had planned again to close the rotunda at 8 p.m., but they decided to keep it open as long as people wanted to come. By 1 o'clock in the morning the next day, Monday the 25th, approximately 76,000 people had filed past Kennedy's coffin. So from like 2:20 p.m. until 1 o'clock the next morning, they had estimated that about 76,000 people had come by the coffin. That's like 14,000 an hour. Okay? Well, they could see they were in trouble because the lines were still long, so they decided at that point, at 1 in the morning, to let people come 2 at a time, because before it was just a single file line. So at that point they said, holy moly, we'll go 2 at a time. What's that? Well, because if you walk in there, that's how you kind of pay respects. You don't crowd it. But they decided to go 2 around. Now, this is a great, unbelievable. At 2 a.m. in the morning on the 25th, guess how long that line was, 2 abreast, to get in there? 3 miles long. You think about that. The line was 3 miles long at 2 in the morning. What's going to happen that day? They're going to have the funeral, so this is getting interesting. So finally, at 10 o'clock in the morning, they closed the doors of the rotunda because they had to get ready for the funeral. There were still people waiting. Can you imagine that kind of a tribute? They started at 2:20 in the afternoon and shut it down at 10 a.m. the next morning. You know how many people they estimated paid their respects by 10 in the morning? 250,000. 250,000 people was estimated that had gone by and paid their respects to the president. 250,000. Just incredible. An incredible tribute to a man. Okay, Monday, we're going to start on November 25th, 1963, the burial of the president. And we should get through this lecture probably by the end of the day, Tuesday. And we'll have a little quiz on it, be worth about 50 points. And then we will put in the video and give you about Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to get to see this just exactly as people saw it then. And then we get back Monday the 9th, all the way with LBJ.
Question.
Yeah.
Who, like, organized all of it, such, but there's so few.
That is such a great question. Who did organize this? Who